starting to think Pablo Neruda might not actually be good. Like, I read 20 Love Songs and a Song of Despair in high school in Merwin's version, and I loved it, but like, I would have loved it if Neruda had done as Orson Welles advised Peter Bogdanovich and just released the title and not bothered to publish the rest of the book. I then read in college a book he either wrote or that like people later compiled that was called The Book of Questions, and then literally was a book of questions. And they just seemed sort of inane. There were things like, do oranges have noses? They're just these sort of like cutesy, self-aware, not magic realism. I don't have it in front of me, but my recollection is that they were sort of self-consciously poet-minded questions. I'm going to return to that idea a little bit later, but like, I am used to hearing Neruda spoken of reverently, and I think it, in part because he was a good socialist, and so he is like he's like one of the rare canonical poets we look back on and think like, yeah, he was all right. He was okay. We don't have to be ashamed of liking him. I was like, I've just generally thought of him as being, like good. And I don't speak Spanish. I do a little bit, but I don't really speak Spanish. Then I read a longer poem of his just the other day called The Heights of Machu Picchu. And it was not great. Like the thought I thought like, oh, he's a beat. Well, like he was born like 20 years before the Beats, so like maybe the Beats were really, Nerudans, but it just felt like he sort of like picked up a big idea and then he just tried to like get some riffs going, with like some anaphora and some, swirl of city, there's some like Whitmanic lyrical panoramas, but mostly just these like anthemic singing with his eyes closed shots on goal. Like he was just sort of seeing what stuck, the way, as you're going through that long section in my favorite section of Howl, where he keeps repeating "I'm with you in Rockland" to his friend who's been institutionalized. Ginsberg just sort of like throws out verses in between the refrain, and some of them land and then some of them are sort of confusing, but he keeps going back to that refrain, and so you feel like you maintain your momentum a lot. And like that's the thing, it's like some of the Heights of Machu Picchu, it's not like none of it got my heart rate up. There's one section I really liked. I'll read it because I thought it was quite good. So this is Tomas Morin's translation. This is the third section. I think it's before he actually gets to Machu Picchu. I will read it in English and then I'll read it in Spanish. And I apologize in advance for my Spanish. Men were threshed like maize in the bottomless granary of deeds no one remembers. I thought that first sentence is pretty good. Men were threshed like maize in the bottomless granary of deeds no one remembers. Of moments covering the full spectrum of misery, and beyond, and not only one death, but many deaths came to each man. Each day a tiny death, dust, worm, a lamp that flickers out in the mud of the suburbs, a tiny death on rough wings pierced each man like a short lance, and thus was he menaced by the bread or the knife, the cattle rancher, the child of seaports, or the dark captain of the plow, or the rodent of the filthy streets. They all despaired waiting for death, their short daily death, and their grinding doom was each day like a black cup from which they drank trembling. That, I think, is pretty good. It's totally over the top, but it feels like a convincing evocation of like despair as experienced in like quotidian working life. Like what it really reminds me of is the the section in kind of early-ish in the Communist Manifesto when Marx describes what it's like to work for a wage, like the way that it sort of subtly alienates you from yourself. I mean, the Communist Manifesto, like so many of the things I've talked about in this podcast, like great at description, very questionable at prescription. But like that part where, like, reading this, I thought, like, yeah, that calls to mind that feeling. It summons up something like that feeling of sort of like quiet daily resignation, specifically as experienced through wage labor. Here quickly is the Spanish. El ser como el maíz se desgranaba en el inacabable granero de los hechos perdidos, de los acontecimientos miserables, del 1 al 7 al 8, y no una muerta, sino muchas muertas llegaba a cada uno. Cada día una muerte pequeña, polvo, gusano, lámpara, que se apaga en el loro del suburbio, una pequeña muerte de alas gruesas, entraba en cada hombre como una corta lanza, y era el hombre asediado del pan o del cuchillo, el ganadero, el hijo de los puertos, o el capitán oscuro del arado, o el roedor de las calles espesas. Todos desfallecieron esperando su muerte, su corta muerte diaria, y se quebranto asiago de cada día era como una copa negra que bebían temblando. So my Spanish is terrible, but again, it like that part I thought he's on a roll, but he is on a roll that rings true and familiar to me. Like I recognize the thing he's on a roll about. It's not just up in the sky or off in his imagination. A lot of the rest of the poem, less so. That's like, again, like the sections in Howl that are the best are the sections where he's talking about people he cares about, whether it's his friend in Rockland or the greatest minds of his generation. Like when you recognize, human care, human experience, at least for me, like those are the moments when a beat like Vatic lyrical carried awayness can be moving. But like overall, I thought, is he just not that good? Like, is he just sort of? Because it also it seems like he's one of these poets who, as with the beats, his persona kind of matters. Like both his persona as a political presence. He was friends with the Allende. Salvador Allende, who was deposed by the CIA, and it's et al. Dad of Isabel, I believe. Anyway, it's not just that he was a good leftist; it's that he we sort of think of him as this romantic figure. I mean, not that he, I don't know, not that he looked like an especially romantic figure, but the realness, the really having happenedness of the love about which he writes seems sort of important. And in that way, he's not unlike the Beats. Authenticity, maybe, personal biographical authenticity seems important in his case. And the poems on their own, I don't know, man. I don't know. There was another poem of his in Marine's second book that I read that also just seemed sort of unremarkable. I haven't been back to Merwin's 20 Love Songs. I mean, again, if there is a specific Neruda poem that one of you really admires as a poem, I would love to read it. Please direct me to it. But Cameron and Shane, please don't send me a 400-page book. For God's sake, I can't take that much more Neruda. But yeah, just it occurred to me maybe he's not actually good. maybe that's just an idle pantheonic figure that's been sitting in my mind as somebody we could count on, and I'm now feeling less confident about that. Speaking of which, you're Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS. I'll do a quick version of the housekeeping. Thank you for listening. Thank you to everybody. Please do hit subscribe on your podcast app, because then you will actually get the podcast regularly, in case you have not done that already. That part's free. I think my dad initially was concerned. It's free to subscribe to the main feed. If you would like to hear more, go to SLEERICKETS.substack.com and subscribe there, or just put in your email address and I'll give you a week's access for free. And you'll get, in addition to getting 3 extra episodes a month, you'll get a shit ton of episodes that are already up there now. I have been thinking about mealy-mouthed ways of talking about poetry. So when I used to write reviews, there are some reviews I wrote where I really said exactly what I thought. And there are a number of those. I had a kind of a longish Joshua Beckman review that I think felt very much. I don't think I sculpted anything for personal or political purposes there. I always tried to tell the truth, or rather, I always tried to not lie. But in many of them, it would be easy to get the incorrect impression that I liked the book I was writing about. I very often, particularly when I was assigned reviews, I very often did not like the book I was writing about. Also, by the way, if you want to read the long review I have on Maury Creech in Literary Matters, that was when I really just was able to write what I meant, including, I've written, there are other reviews in which I wrote about poets I admired, my Christian Ryman review about his Selected. I did admire him. I did have to shape that one for reasons having to do with careers other than my own. I had to adjust that one, but I did and do admire him, despite what I might say later in this episode. The long Maury Creech review, as well as an earlier one of another one of his books, I just really like him, as I've said already on the podcast, and I talked about some of the things I didn't like, and that one I was very frank, but that was the exception to the rule. Mostly what I found I did is I would just try to, I think I've said this elsewhere, I tried to damn with accurate praise. I tried to just describe what happened, say nothing of my own judgment of it, but then, be specific enough in my description that people who might not already be big fans would at least have a chance of seeing that the book in question might not be so great. But I did bite my tongue a lot. I did pull punches. I did simply withhold my own opinion. I mean, I'm talking with Ryan right now about a review by a young poet about an older poet that we were both friends with, and it's super harsh. It's a very, very harsh review. And it's made me think about what are we after with reviews? Because obviously the long form blurb thing is kind of useless. It's most useful for the purposes of ingratiating the reviewer to the reviewee. Those being the two people who will most thoroughly read it. And at the same time, I think just willy-nilly hatchet throwing is not so great, particularly I think for one thing, you don't want to attack people who are brand new. But I also tend to think it doesn't make as much sense to attack someone who is not in favor. The targets who seem fairest for harsh criticism are those who are prominently celebrated. A harsh review makes most sense as a minority report, as a dissent. When it is the primary contributor to the conversation, it seems less useful, because that is a case in which the poetry is going to go without saying. I mean, the verdict, which is don't read this, will go without saying. Like, people were already not going to read it. It's when people were going to read it, when it has been widely celebrated, that a harsh review seems most called for. But beyond that, like, I thought about the review made me aware of another distinction, which is there is sort of walking through the poetry and showing how it doesn't do a good job at what it is attempting to do, which this review, like, this was a very smart review. But then there is sharing one's own judgment on what poems should try to do. And that part, I think, I don't know. Like, it's interesting sometimes. I think maybe an individual review is not the place for that, is my leaning. But we'll see how Ryan feels. And anyway, like, it's not that it was like a wrong or bad review. It was like pretty smart and pretty right overall. But yeah, like, I'm having to be diplomatic in another case because I'll be writing a little thing about a poet at the request of a friend. And it's something I'm happy to do, but it means I'm having to do a little bit of the old reviewing trick. And all of this has sort of made me think about what poems are about, like what poems are really doing these days. Because a few people have written me recently about my old essay, Why Poems Don't Make Sense. And I've said, in correspondence as well as on this podcast, like, I wouldn't probably write that essay today for like, both because I might approach the question slightly differently and because I think, like, it's not as relevant a question today as it was at the time, or even, like, probably, arguably 5 or 10 years before the time. Like, nonsense poetry is not a big phenomenon in American poetry today. But it's made me think about, so what is? And I think of myself as being someone who's not especially up on contemporary poetry, but then I looked through, I'm copying Joanna's lead, and I keep a record of all the books I read. And I was just looking through the books I've read in 2023, and they're like 80% poetry. And, like, these are mostly, at least broadly contemporary, but, like, these are mostly people who are alive. These are not, I think, probably the main, like, these aren't the people who are most often featured in the New Yorker or even Poetry Magazine, or getting poems selected for the New York Times Magazine thing that they do. But, like, these are contemporary poets. But yeah, like, I was just trying to think, like, well, so what is the deal? Like, what is... Because I still don't like most contemporary poetry. I mean, like, these people are generally the exception. Like, these people are generally, like, the people I do like among contemporary poets. But, like, when I dip into... we recently got copies of Copper Nickel and the Spoon River Poetry Review, and dipping into those, or dipping to, like, Rattle. I get, like, a new Rattle thing every 5 minutes. Mostly it's not so good. Mostly I sort of, like, at best I kind of shrug, and at worst I'm infuriated. And I was trying to think, like, so what is it exactly that is in, if nonsense is not quite in at the moment? And I looked at a couple of poems in a recent issue of the New Yorker. So it had poems by two fairly prominent poets, like fairly well celebrated poets today. One was Christian Wyman and the other was Nicole Seeley. So they're both pretty short. I'll read them. Here's this is Christian Wyman's. It's called Ars Poetica. It has two. It's written in two parts. It starts with an indentation and an M dash, and then the first letter is lowercase. 1. A plum and othering dusk. Something renunciatory in the light. Until the sparrow takes the old tree's shape, and the trees untreed are everywhere. If I could let go, if I could know what there is to let go, if I could chance the night's improvidence and be the being this hard mercy means. 2. These lost and charnel thoughts, less thoughts than bits of stun. It's bits of stun, S-T-U-N. I suddenly find myself among, that are the me I am when I am not, sleeked to reason and pacific despair, speak to me of a pain that saves, some endmost ear to shrive the mind. So Wyman is a well-known poet. It's also well known that he has he sort of long suffered with a terminal disease, and that he is a rare, successful, contemporary, very publicly religious poet. He's a Christian with some, I don't know, like Buddhist furniture in the room. He's written a lot of poems I admire. He's written a lot of poems that moved me, or that had lines that really stuck in my mind, that surprised me, that touched me, that made me laugh a little bit, that just sounded great, that showed me a sort of a new trick with language. So he's written a good number of poems that I have praised, and praised sincerely. This, I think, is a bad poem. I mean, this is, I think, I'm tempted to repeat Dave Smith's old refrain from Workshop and say, looks like a poem, quacks like a poem, but it's not a poem. In fact, this is very much what, as I mentioned to Alexis recently, this is what Nicholson Baker's narrator in the anthologist would call a plum. And in fact, those are the first two words of the poem: a plum and othering dusk. Something renunciatory in the light, until the sparrow takes the old tree's shape, and the trees untreed are everywhere. If I could let go, if I could know what there is to let go, if I could chance the night's improvidence and be the being this hard mercy means. These lost and charnel thoughts, less thoughts than bits of stun, I suddenly find myself among, that are the me I am when I am not, sleeked to reason and pacific despair, speak to me of a pain that saves, some endmost ear to shrive the mind. I think this is hogwash. I think like the like chatty deep imagism with abruptly broken syntax is a game that Franz Wright played pretty well, except that his poems usually had punchlines. Like they would have some evocative gobbledygook, but then they would also have like a good closer. They would have some kind of 1-2 punch to them. And this just sort of tails off. I mean, it's got, I think that it is not insignificant that we know Wyman personally is a Christian. The sparrow, the renunciation, the hard mercy, the me I am when I am not, the pain that saves, the shriving the mind. I mean, these are all religious phrases or suggestions. And I think here's what I think is happening here. I think it would be possible to do what my Ratbag poetry podcasting buddy David Jalal / Motamed, the like 2-name guy who wrote in from Australia, though he's American and he does the Ratbag poetics. I think like what he might do is he would be able to like draw lines and connect this. Like, oh, he's looking outside, the sparrow's moving in the trees, there's an illusion that the trees are, because he has another poem where he talks about a tree full of birds and the birds all take off, and he briefly has the illusion that the tree has has taken off into the sky. So it feels a little bit like he's maybe calling back to that. He's obviously very sick, and he's thinking about his future. He's thinking about the Shakespearean image of the day ending as the echo of the man's life ending. He's thinking about prayer and thought and, being and not being, and whether this includes the soul or the mind or the consciousness. It's not that one couldn't come up with a story that sort of connects the dots in this poem. It's just that I think those dots are best connected by being Christian Wyman. And I think the effectiveness of this poem sort of rests on our knowing that like this poem is not really meant for us to understand. And I actually resist even the kind of the more enlightened view of like, oh, well, poems aren't meant to be understood. They're meant to be experienced. I don't know that this is even really meant to be experienced by us. I think this is meant for us to read and to say to ourselves, like, boy, if you're Christian Wyman, this really all makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of deep religious poetic wisdom in this poem, but you have to be Christian Wyman to get it. And we sort of experience a moment of faith and think like, yeah, that's out there somewhere. That's real. That's true. And reading the poem, we feel connected to a real life poet who's out there thinking deep thoughts and having religious and poetic experiences. And we feel a little bit of like vicarious inspiration. Like, it's like when your team wins the game, or when like you set up friends and then they get married, right? All of which are like fine experiences. But I think this is an experience where we're not even really, the poem is not for us. We are not even really experiencing the poem. We are just given good evidence that somebody somewhere is really experiencing this poem, and that's deep, man. And it matters, man. This feels to me like a kind of like, it's like sorcery. This feels like poetic sorcery, or really like charlatanism. Like this feels like the Duke and the Dauphin, if the Duke and the Dauphin believed their own bullshit. The other poem in here by Nicole Seeley, let me find it. All right, this is Nicole Seeley. This is the Ferguson Report, an erasure, and then in italics underneath that it says pages 65 to 77. So a couple things. This is, I understand, a part of a larger project in which she's doing an erasure of the Ferguson Report. So here's what the Ferguson Report actually is, which I think sort of matters. I mean, like she would probably say it like definitely matters. Like it doesn't sort of matter. It probably definitely matters, right? So the Ferguson Report so you can see it online. It's a United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division publication published March 4th, 2015. It is the report of an investigation of the Ferguson, Missouri Police Department. It is 102 pages long, and the conclusion was not good for the Ferguson, Missouri Police Department. Here's the conclusion. The conclusion is one paragraph. 100 pages describing what they found, and here's the conclusion. Our investigation indicates that Ferguson as a city has the capacity to reform its approach to law enforcement. A small municipal department may offer greater potential for officers to form partnerships and have frequent positive interactions with Ferguson residents, repairing and maintaining police-community relationships. See, for example, Jim Burrick, Putting the Local Back in Local Law Enforcement in American Policing in 2022. Essays on the Future of the Profession, pages 78 through 83, publication details. These reform efforts might be well worth the considerable time and dedication they will require, as they have the potential to make Ferguson safer and more united. So, like, Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, and there were huge protests. This sort of started a whole movement. I think Black Lives Matter might have existed before this, but this sort of gave it a lot of gas. The investigation specifically into Michael Brown's killing yielded like somewhat mixed results. Like there's a lot of disagreement about that. What there's not disagreement about is the Ferguson Report. The Department of Justice looked into the Ferguson Police Department and said like, oh, this is fucked up. Like there are real problems here. There's real racism happening here, and like it needs to change, and like it needs to change on a systemic level. Like that's the part people don't disagree about. People disagree about Michael Death's killing, but like that was the occasion for an investigation that turns out was like really, really necessary and like really important. And I think like I don't think that's really controversial. So I find it sort of interesting that she's chosen to do an erasure, not of like if the Ferguson Report had concluded that like the Ferguson Police Department was just fine, then I might understand an erasure that was sort of challenged that claim. But the report seems to say like the department is not fine. It's fucked up and it needs to change. And it specifically needs to change like its treatment of black citizens of Ferguson. So, I'm curious about this. Like, so what is the purpose of revising, or like an erasure typically is a poem in which you cut away most of an existing text and you draw out of it a kind of a hidden text. There's I think maybe the best example I've seen is Tracy K. Smith's Declaration, which is an erasure of the Declaration of Independence. It also ran in the New Yorker, and it both evoked some of the spirit of the original document, the Declaration of Independence, and it brought out a kind of an undercurrent of the horror of chattel slavery that was happening in the United States and would continue to happen in the United States, despite the claims made in the Declaration. Like that is an erasure that both makes sense and I think was pretty well executed. Here's this erasure. The Ferguson Report, an erasure, pages 65 to 77. They say stand in line, so we stand in line. As the line advances, they say stand still. Around us, everything going like cars or clouds. Us, the blur cars pass, the blue clouds dam. They say wait, so we wait, as if for some fragrant flower that unfurls one night a year. They say shh, so like trees, we mouth cross sounds of flags beaten to shreds by wind. Our heads twitch, birds watching for what might be stalking. Right before they deploy canines to bite, there's a pause between wails in which you hear your shut eyes dilate. Listen. So it's evocative. It seems to suggest a scene in which, some oppressive force is giving orders, making commands, making violent threats upon some population, and in fact committing acts of violence against that population. I mean, all things that seem consistent with the report that's being erasured. And it, maybe I'm being cynical about this, but while I can make more sense of this than I can of the Wyman poem, I think this is sort of also hogwash. I think this is an occasion for a bunch of erasure poems. And I don't know that this isn't memorable. It's not really very moving. It doesn't even sort of conceptually make a cool point. It just seems like, hey, if this is in the New Yorker and you see this, you see the Ferguson Report, an erasure, you understand erasure is sort of a poetic technique that's currently used by a lot of progressive poets and often black poets to draw out a reality that was previously ignored, and you say, hey, Ferguson Report was important. Ferguson was fucked up. The word Ferguson reminds me of the Black Lives Matter movement and reminds me of being a good progressive. And I'm the kind of person who reads a magazine that has a poem called The Ferguson Report, an erasure. And you read it and it's sort of easy on the eyes and it's short enough. And you say yeah. Right before they deploy canines to bite, there's a pause between wails in which you hear your shut eyes dilate. Listen, subscriber to the New Yorker. Listen to what a good progressive you are. I mean, I'm a bad progressive. This is bullshit. This is a different kind of the same bullshit. It's an appeal to authenticity that doesn't actually produce any poetic effect. This produces a psychosocial effect, a lot like the fucking Wyman poem, though maybe from a different direction. And I think that's some of what is happening right now. That's not even what Cameron and I talked a fair amount recently about, neo-confessionalism, and I do want to dig into more of that with him at some point on Mike. But I think this is some of the bullshit that's happening. This sort of appeal to authenticity, either the authenticity of the poet. I mean, that's part of what neo-confessionalism is about. Is an appeal to the authentic identity and persona of the poet as a thing that is real and exists and is important. or, an appeal to a sort of an important political project, or, among, I guess, religious readers, like an appeal to a religious reality. That's the thing. I did an interesting exchange with Ryan in which I sent him a Hayden Carruth poem called None that I like. I think it's not a perfect poem, but like it's a poem I've always sort of liked. And he said it was charming, but he sort of laughed at it. And it was interesting because he said, I'll read it for you real quick because I think it's not a bad poem to read. But maybe I'll be interested. If you are yourself religious, you might find it to be laughable or sentimental. So here's None. Let me find it. Okay, this is the second to last poem in his collected shorter poems, which is the book I read that really made me fall in love with him. Total madman, and wrote across all sorts of different forms and just had a whole life full of nervous breakdowns. But I rather like this one. It's called None. You died. And because you were Greek, they gave you a coin to carry under your tongue and then also biscuits and honey. When you came to the riverbank, you saw a crazy-looking black bumboat on the water with a figure standing in it, lanky and dressed darkly, holding a sweep. If you haven't picked up yet, he's walking us through the Greek underworld. He's saying this person he knew died, and then he's describing how she descended into the underworld, or he descended into the underworld. We don't know. I'll start over. None. You died. And because you were Greek, they gave you a coin to carry under your tongue, and then also biscuits and honey. When you came to the riverbank, you saw a crazy-looking black bumboat on the water with a figure standing in it, lanky and dressed darkly, holding a sweep. You were taken across, and you gave your coin for the passage and continued until you came to a three-headed dog who snarled and threatened you, even though you were not trying to escape. You gave him the biscuits smeared with honey, and you passed onward to the field of asphodel and through the gate of Tartarus. Or... and there's a stanza break. So he just told us about this person who died and was Greek and went through the Greek underworld. Or you died and you were Navajo. They had carried you out of the Hogan earlier, so you'd die in the sunshine. Or if it happened inside suddenly, they stuffed up the smoke hole and boarded the front entrance and cut an opening in the back, the north-facing, dark-facing side, to carry you out, and no one ever used that Hogan again. They took off your moccasins and put them on again wrong side too, the left one on the right foot, the right on the left, so that your chindi would be confused and unable to return along your tracks. They washed your hair in suds made from the yucca. Then they gave you enough fried bread and water to last 4 days, and you set off on your journey. But actually, none of these things happened. You just died. So that's None. And I like it, not just because of the jibber jabber line break revelation punchline of the ending, but because the two descriptions of different traditional approaches to responding to the death of a loved one were moving and felt very tangible and comfortingly concrete and specific and thorough in a way that like a contemporary American vaguely Christian funeral doesn't feel especially specific and tangible. The funeral I went to most recently, we left a box of ashes at the grave site, but then we were supposed to just walk away and trust that somebody was going to bury it. That sucked. That was horrible. So yeah, feeding a coin and biscuits and honey, and putting the moccasins on the wrong way around and taking you out a different hole in the Hogan. All of this stuff feels sort of movingly like some kind of answer. And then it's devastating at the end, not because it's a surprise that in fact death is just death, but because it was nice to think otherwise for a while. Isn't it pretty to think so, as Jake says in The Sun Also Rises? It was nice to think of something that it might be otherwise, and of course it could only be this. But Ryan's response was to say, no, this is sentimental. He was never going to allow it to be anything but that died. You died and you just died. And so all of this sort of messing around in between the first line and the last line is just sort of cutesy thumb fiddling, right? It's like he's just sort of playing around because he's so dedicated to his nihilism that he was never going to let anything else happen, and so it's a sort of a static poem. It doesn't have any motion to it, and I can understand that if you really truly believe in God and the afterlife. So maybe like if you really are religious, you read that Christian Wyman poem and you think like, boy, that really calls to mind what it's like. But man, it would be nice to have some like complete fucking sentences, you know? All right, where am I at? Because I can't go on forever. All right, I have a bunch of other stuff that's been on my mind, but I will mention briefly. I'm having to be diplomatic, but like, I think another thing that is happening, like not an especially new thing, but maybe like a like common thing in the poetry world. So like I was having another conversation with a friend about this contemporary poet, and I said like, well, what he really reminds me of is like all those like old nice but mediocre white guys who like bummed their way into a creative writing professorship like 30 years ago and just sort of like pumped out middling, vaguely versified meditations on their comfortable professor of creative writing lives, you know, and occasionally, you know, diddled their students. Like this guy was not white and he was not that age, but it felt like that same kind of exercise. And I tried to pin down like, so what is that exactly? Because the thing about these books by these like at this point, like 70 to, you know, 70 plus year old white creative writing professors, white male creative writing professors, most of whom are still hanging on to their jobs. Again, there are some who are great, but there are a lot who are not. And I think it's just partly because like you could just sort of like fail your way into a job like that at that time if you were a white guy. You know, that still happens some, but I think it happens in slightly different ways usually, and maybe sometimes for slightly different people. But you know, academic mediocrity is nothing new. It's all it has been with us always. But like so what is the thing about their books? Like their books are not good, and there are too many of them. They do pump out too many of them. But like they're not, you know, as I said like a long time ago in the episode on getting an MFA, like the main thing an MFA will do for your poetry is it will make it less embarrassing. It won't make it better, but it will make it less overtly embarrassing. And so the books of poems of these guys, these baby boomer generation white male poetic mediocrities, their books are not embarrassing. They're not terrible. It's not that there's nothing in them that you could point to and say like, yeah, that's kind of like the thing they're teaching in their workshops to their students. Yeah, it's probably very much like what they're teaching their students to do. They're not embarrassing, but they're also like completely unmemorable, usually not particularly moving. They do have, you know, they do show, don't tell. They do write what you know. They do include image, and they are usually about emotions. My daughter's learning about poetry and drama in school, and the main thing she learned, the most important thing she learned, is that it's about expressing yourself, which I gently called into question before she responded by saying like, tell me a story. We were having dinner, there's the two of us. And I said, okay, I think I have two stories I could tell you. And she said, let me guess. Do they have death in them? And so I told her not to be so impudent and not to assume she knows so much about her old man. And then I told her to paraphrase stories by Nietzsche. And a little Kafka for variety. But yeah, like these these poetic mediocrities wrote books that express themselves, but I think that's really it. Like my daughter also recently read The Giver, the old Lois Lowry book, and The Giver is about the main guy in The Giver, not the main character, but the sort of the most important figure in The Giver. Is like it takes place in this horrifying utopia or dystopia where nobody has emotions and nobody sees colors and everything is sort of perfectly regimented and there's a lot of euthanasia. But they have this one guy. It's sort of like it's like a less horrifying version of The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. That's what it is, because it's Salem backwards with an O at the front. So The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas is the Ursula K. Le Guin story where like there's a utopia and everybody in it is really happy, but there's like one child who has to live in a torture dungeon and just be miserable for its whole life. And like in order for the utopia to work, that child has to be kept in total darkness and misery. In The Giver, it's not darkness and misery, but you do have this one old man, and he has to sort of have all the memories of the community. Like they don't have all these memories. They don't have any sense of history. They don't have emotions. They don't have color. They're sort of these like neutered, blindered, utopic creatures, and he's sort of the one complete human. Like they need to have him there he's called the receiver of memories, and he has to be sort of the reservoir of like real human experience and emotion in order for their community to continue to function. And so then the story is about a little boy who comes of age, and he's told like, well, you're going to be the next receiver of memories, and so he has to go be an apprentice, and he gets his mind blown. Spoiler, he leaves in the end. He walks away from Omelas. I think he sleds away from Omelas technically, but I was thinking about The Giver because I thought like, well, these mediocre guys and this poet I'm being diplomatic about for reasons of friendship right now, not because I'm friends with him, but because I'm being diplomatic for the sake of a friend. But like these mediocre poets, and I think like a lot of poets today, what they do, they're not the receivers of memories, because it's not like they're actually like retaining all of this intense, powerful stuff that the rest of us can't handle. It's not really like, that's not what's happening. They're not the, you can't handle the truth guys. They're handling like very mundane quotidian truths. They're handling like having a crush on a student while you work 6 hours a week, a 6-figure job, and your biannual sabbatical. Sorry, I know most professorships are not that cushy. And most professorships today aren't even professorships. They're like adjunctships working fucking 5/5 schedules. But we're talking about the baby boomer white male professors who had those really, really nice gigs while they were still up for the having. So their poems, they're not reservoirs of powerful feeling, but they do have a kind of emotion related function. And I don't think it's that they're like receiving memories, and I don't even think that they're like illuminating memory. It's not like they're teaching us anything or showing us anything or helping us to feel something that we weren't already feeling. They're expressing themselves. And I was thinking like, they don't receive the memory, they like refry it or reheat it, or like the long last story in David Foster Wallace' last book before he died, because I think The Pale King came out after he died, but his last book before he died was called Oblivion. It was a collection of short stories, very like interesting, good, mixed, difficult book. But the last story in it, I think, was also the most celebrated. It was called The Suffering Channel, and it was about a TV channel where all they did all the time was they showed footage of people suffering horribly. And the program they come up with over the course of the story is for this like terminally shy, profoundly henpecked, like deeply introverted, repressed, clenched, anxious man who can't stand to have a conversation with anybody, can't stand to see anybody, can't stand to be seen by anybody, and he's so repressed. He's like squeezed like a fist around himself that when he shits, it comes out in these sort of like perfect, strange, like hard sculptural shapes. Like he sculpts perfect little like pieces of furniture or like messages in writing with his shit. And the idea of the channel they're going to have is they're going to have him on a giant plexiglass throne with cameras zooming in so that you can see the shit being produced as he shits it out, which is of course like not only like a horrible idea generally, but like his perfect nightmare. Like I think the end of the story is he shits a message asking the TV producer to like help him escape. I think like that's the end of the story if I remember. But like it's actually like they're not even like refrying or reheating the memories, they're excreting them. Like what we really see in these mediocre poems is evidence that somebody has experienced something and then recounted that experience of something in a way that suggests that he's really thought about it, and he's able to kind of compare the sensory experiences surrounding the memory to other things, and he's able to sort of compress it and dehydrate it and digest it and shape it into something sort of impressive. But really all we're getting is evidence that like a feeling was had. I think that like we're getting these little perfect sculpted message turds. And I don't mean to like, they're not like, the turds in the story are really impressive, but I do think that's sort of what they are. Like I don't think that's what Wyman is doing exactly in this poem. I don't think it's what Nicole Seeley is doing in this poem, but I do think like it's a kind of thing that happens. And one of the most infuriating examples of this phenomenon is our old friend Ben Lerner. I think Ben Lerner, to be clear, because I did, in New York, Josh said like, hey, I think he's quite a good prose writer, and I think 1004 in particular, I think he said was really excellent. I believe it. I believe he's capable of writing really, really good books. He is a very smart guy, and he is very adept with language. However, when he writes poetry, he seems to have zero interest in making the reader feel anything, helping the reader understand anything, leaving any verbal fragments in the reader's mind. He seems mostly interested in providing evidence of his own mind at play. There's a just totally maddening short piece that I read in my computer. Ever since it updated, it's convinced that I'm a robot, and it keeps trying to like de-robotify me. Oh, it's in McSweeney's. So it was a thing written by Jesse Nathan, who's an old McSweeney's head, and he just writes this like insufferable introduction to his short conversation with Lerner. I'll just read you the first paragraph. Ben Lerner's first book of poem in 13 years, The Lights. That's a poem I talked about on this podcast a while ago. Again, has a lot of great stuff in it. Almost perversely refuses to be a poem. Like he deliberately, he's like the guy who won the most recent season of Making the Cut, the like revamped, refried Project Runway knockoff that Amazon does. I love this stuff with Joanne and I. This is like the one kind of reality show like we both really enjoy. I like watching fashion people make fashion things. The three people who were the finalists were a brilliant, emotional Brazilian imp, a like fabulously talented, sturdy English mum, and just like like thoroughly vile German troll, who is a very tall, very handsome model who then like uglified himself for art and then produced just like endless fashion objects that were just like hideous, unwearable, not even like particularly well constructed clothing like phenomena. And it was just like he ended up winning the whole thing. He was the worst designer and the most insufferable personality in the whole show. He went all the way. He beat everyone else out. He's the one Amazon is funding, giving $1 million and producing his whole line. Terrible. I mean, it was such an Emperor's New Clothes situation. In his final show, he literally had a like bunched up, heavily starched men's shirt, sort of clumped on the front of a female model who walked down the runway and then turned around. And then in the back, she was just naked. And like, that was the ta-da. That was his artwork. Again, like, it wasn't even well made. It was just like clothes that had then been like chopped up and then thrust in your face to say like, aha, for art. And listening to the judges praise them was just, you know, everything they had to say was about how now and how brave and how creative and how experimental this was. There was no like, this is really pretty, or like, oh, I would love to wear that, or oh, that looks really good, or oh, that seems really well made, or that drapes really well, or like, oh, what fascinating design. No, it was just, this is a really smart concept. Like, I wouldn't wear the clothes of the other two designers, but they were good. Like, they were after something, and they made things that like people would actually want to buy and wear and looked good on them. This guy Yannick was just the worst. And I think Lerner is like maybe a more talented verbal Yannick. Here, I'll go back to the Jesse Nathan piece I was reading. So Ben Lerner's first book of poems. In 13 years, The Lights gathers several kinds of lines and sets them talking to one another. Gathers several kinds of lines and sets them talking to one another. Several styles intertwined so that the play of forms itself is a poem. Okay, fine. He goes on, one form, one thread, is made up of waterfalls of prose, unparagraphed and sometimes covering several pages. So just like prose poetry. Another thread consists of shorter... Those poems, by the way, those giant prose blocks, miserable to read. At least the ones I've read, miserable. Another thread consists of shorter lines, the first letter of the line often capitalized. Novel concept of capitalizing the first letter of the line. Poetry that's sometimes disjunctive, as if the relationship between the end of one line and the beginning of the next were not so much an enjambment, a term whose root, by the way, refers to a racing horse stepping outside the lines, as an occasion for representing a glitch. I mean, what it is, like, it's like a cut-ups. Like, he took lines from one paragraph and he chopped them up and just placed them next to another. Like, that's clearly what it is when you read the poems. It's just it's lineated confetti. Nathan goes on, a glitch in our electronic communications, ? Our signal, ? The hesitations of the voice, a smoothness, this sentence gave me an aneurysm, a smoothness in Lerner's poetry is always revolting against itself. I'll read that again. A smoothness in Lerner's poetry is always revolting against itself. I mean, fuck if I know. Fuck if I know what that's supposed to mean. He goes on later, the strands, he's talking about these different strands. These like he writes in a few different forms. Call them forms if you like. Mostly this is just a change in typography. Like a typography, or then with the glitches, it's just finger weaving lines from two different poems together so that they become confusing. He goes on, the strands mingle sometimes into hybrid emergences. The strands mingle sometimes into hybrid emergences. I just had a conversation last night or the night before last with a poet friend who said, hey, have you noticed everybody's calling everything an emergence lately? Here it is again. The strands mingle sometimes into hybrid emergences, and other times they openly or formally inveigh against one another, casting lyrical aspersions or doubts. And one thing they ask, at least by implication, is whether experience is continuous. I mean, sure. Like, you could also just like rip a bunch of pages out of the middle of the book, and like, I guess that would ask the same question. He goes on, an unanswerable question, but I raise it in part to emphasize that this poet is working at the height of his powers. Did you follow that? an unanswerable question, but I raise it in part to emphasize that this poet is working at the height of his powers. How does that emphasize that he's working at the height of his powers? He goes on, moving from epideixis to mystery to knife-edged clarity. Epideixis, which I had to look up, is the intentional display of rhetorical or oratorical skill. According, I think that's the Oxford that's excerpted there. So that I totally believe. He's deliberately demonstrating rhetorical or oratorical skill. There's, Ben Lerner's poetry is nothing if not show-offy. He's working at the height of his powers, moving from epideixis to mystery to knife-edged clarity. I mean, fine. Okay, fine. He later says there is no American poet using this primal and primary poetic tool, repetition, with more power than Ben Lerner. And I do know a handful of formalists who might take exception to that claim. I did look up Jesse Nathan's book. He has his most recent book, Eggtooth, which is, I mean, you don't have to be an unhip formalist to have a fucking hideous book cover, because this book cover is terrible. Just like dull yellow and teal blocks with like two pale teal stripes across, and then just like big dumb sort of squared off serif text saying Eggtooth Jesse line break Nathan, forward by Robert Hass. The thing that blows my mind about this cover is that underneath that is an excerpt of the poetry, but it cuts off the poetry after the beginning of the line. That is, like, they took a stanza and they justified it to the left of the cover, and then they justified it left another inch or so. So you just miss, like, letters are cut off in mid-letter. So that what it actually says is, "Trify my shins, imagining my stanza ending, grid within me while my lines run on, creeks across pastures beneath a huge sun, remembering, already halved by the line of the land half imagined, half vanished as a fog comes not upon the earth but out of it." Which is to say, you are not even really supposed to read it. You can't read it. Like, you can't read it, and that's sort of the point. So that's Jesse Nathan's cover. I feel sort of bad for Ben Lerner, actually, in this short conversation, because Jesse Nathan so clearly sent him an annoying email, and then Lerner eventually responded. You imagine this being sort of like Rilke responding to that young poet, thinking he's just going to have to write the one, and then ending up writing fucking 9 more, however many it is. So Nathan's totally clotted and opaque non-question is, which Lerner calls a good, wide, impossible question. Nathan says, "I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the line." You could just say that. Just, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the line. That would be at least sort of an okay prompt. And how you think about it in the lights, particularly as compared to previous collections. But I'm also curious more generally about your approach to this basic unit of poetry, what its stakes are in your view, and its possibility. Just say fewer words, man. Just say fewer words. Fewer clauses, fewer sentences, fewer words. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the line. That's something. But he goes on and on and on. And then we get like all caps Ben Lerner : and what follows is like very clearly the entire text of an email. Like from Dear Jesse to, sign off B, lowercase b period. Like, I don't, like, did he want Nathan to publish this? Like, copy pasted into McSweeney's? It feels like not. But then here's what blows my mind. Like, either he writes this way about his own poetry, intending for the public to read it, and he's just insufferably full of himself, or he's writing this just to his friend, and he only means for his friend to read it, and this is how he writes about his poetry, to his friend. Like, I don't know which is worse. I really don't. Here's what he says. I mean, I can't read all this. It's terrible. He does twice quote his own poetry, not informatively, but evocatively. Like he quotes his own poetry to give the paragraph a little atmosphere. His own poetry. He also writes, and it took me a second to recognize what this was. He quotes the longer email that we didn't read. He quotes from it, saying basically saying I'm such a poet. When I see your prose, I already begin to turn it into poetry in my mind. And he writes out the guy's line with line breaks in it, not interesting line breaks. Quotation mark, and I ask, inserted line break, partly in light, inserted line break, of the fact, ellipsis, quotation mark. He's not adding anything, he's just demonstrating how poetic he is. Here's what he says about his own poetry. This book lets a lot more difference in. He's talking difference from his other books. Differences of time and experience and the forms they've occasioned, and I patterned those patterns later. Didn't dictate any of it in advance with a procedure. Okay, that's kind of an answer. These poems were not written according to a deliberate form. I added the forms after the fact. Okay, fine. He goes on, he says, oh God, this next sentence is so fucking long, I can't stand it. Okay. Here he goes on, he describes here, again, he's sort of literally answering the question in a way that I'm sympathize with, but this is that same fucking thing where somebody asks you so how did you come up with this poem? Don't answer. Don't just report on the mind events that led to these words being on the page. Tell an interesting story. Say something novel about poetry. Tell a fucking joke. Produce an entertaining non sequitur. Don't just report your thoughts. But this is exactly what he does. He says, sometimes one genre of line incubated another. The way that sentences for 1004 grew out of the dark through, or I dilated some of dilation into that book, or elements of the Topeka school were in the untitled... he has a poem called Untitled, and then in parenthesis, triptych, close parenthesis. Oh, come on, Ben. We're in the untitled triptych first, or certain prose formulations were sucked back into the vortex of a poem where they broke up like alien craft. I just mean, okay, fine. He's just reporting these horrible, dull mind events. It's yes, this is literally how the words came out of my brain to be on the page. But then he seems really to be, this is where I get the sense that he is performing the Suffering Channel routine for us. He is demonstrating his poetic bona fides by showing what a poet he is in his soul. He says, I just mean language returns under different formal pressures on every level for me, returns to test the difference a formal difference makes. That's one sense of measure. Did you know, Jesse? That's one sense of measure. It's all absurd how much of my life is ringing, and then in parentheses, he writes, WRINGING, question mark, close parenthesis, ringing, small changes on, and then again in parenthesis, from, these words and phrases as they fall across margins, and yet every time, oh, Jesus Christ, this last clause, and yet every time recontextualization yields a new possibility of meaning, a blue spark rises in the dark. So either he meant for McSweeney's to publish this for our benefit, in which case I think he is performing the role of the authentic poetic soul. We are meant, as with a fucking Kenny Goldsmith book, to buy this book, have it on our shelves, maybe pass our eyeballs across the page, mostly just to reassure ourselves that it truly is authentic poetry produced by an authentic poet who lives somewhere in the world authentically as a poet, being a poet for our benefit, like the monks who would pray for all mankind in their monasteries far away. Or this is how he writes an email to his friend, because he signs off with a very nice note about the guy's fucking baby. And he says, I hope everyone there is doing very well. And he has a little jokey sign off that's a normal friend jokey thing to do when you're signing off from a personal email. This whole thing blew my mind, but it convinced me that our poets are if they're not performing, I think maybe authenticity is a lot, because like the neo-confessionalism and the suffering channel routine and the like Wyman performance of addle-brained religious mysticism and the Nicole Seeley social justice exercise, like all of it seems to be some sort of appeal to authenticity. So like maybe that's the sort of game we're playing with poetry at the moment. Either way, I'm fucking sick of it, man. Enough. I kind of want to get back to nonsense now. Like I kind of want, like I almost want to say bring back Flarf. I have a bunch more stuff I want to get to at some point, but that's enough for now. It's totally not. This is a totally inauthentic experience. But one of my favorite podcasts, one of the main hosts had a heart attack recently, and or other major medical event, and has been out of commission, and the podcast has been offline for a week or so, and they came back, and like apparently he's sort of recovering, but like those, like I don't know those people, that has nothing to do with me. I'm like one of many thousands of people who listen to their podcast, but yeah, like it made me think that I love all of you, even the haters, even the welcome haters. I suffer the little children to come unto me, suffer the haters to come unto me. Thanks to all of you. I love you and I miss you, those of you who I have ever seen or will get to see at some point. And with any luck, I will be speaking to you again you can write to me at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com if you want to send in any of your notes, including like a good Pablo Neruda poem. If you've got one. If you've got a good Pablo Neruda poem, preferably on the short end, then please send it my way. Or just confirm my suspicion that he's just like a mediocre proto beat who occasionally had good riffs. But anyway, fucking finish this sign off. With any luck, I'll be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.